The champagne glass shattered against the restaurant floor, drawing every eye in Romano's to our corner table. My wife Victoria stood there, her emerald dress catching the candlelight, her voice cutting through the romantic ambiance like a blade through silk. "I'm done with this marriage, Marcus. Completely done." The waiter froze mid-step, other diners turned to stare, and the piano player seemed to miss a note. It was our 15th wedding anniversary, and she'd just announced the end of our life together in front of a room full of strangers. Most husbands would have scrambled to salvage the moment, begged her to lower her voice, or felt their world collapse right there among the white tablecloths and flickering candles. Instead, I smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a broken one, but a knowing smile that seemed to unsettle her more than any tears could have. Because what Victoria didn't realize was that I'd been expecting this moment for exactly 4 months and 13 days. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus Kellerman, and at 43, I've spent the last 18 years building and managing commercial real estate portfolios across the Pacific Northwest. Not the glamorous side of real estate that gets featured in magazines, but the methodical work of analyzing market trends, negotiating lease agreements, and turning underperforming properties into profitable investments. I'm the guy who walks through empty office buildings and sees potential where others see problems. Numbers don't lie to me. Patterns reveal themselves in spreadsheets and financial reports long before they become obvious to everyone else. That analytical mindset that made me successful in business also made me incredibly observant at home. And for the past 4 months, Victoria's patterns had been screaming a truth she thought she was hiding. We lived in Bellevue, Washington, in a contemporary house overlooking Lake Sammamish, the kind of neighborhood where Teslas sit in driveways and everyone knows each other's net worth by the square footage of their homes. Victoria and I had built what looked like the perfect life. She worked as a marketing director for a tech startup downtown, I managed a portfolio worth north of $50 million, and we spent our weekends hiking the Cascades or exploring new restaurants in Seattle. From the outside, we were the couple everyone envied. Successful, attractive, financially secure, living the American dream in one of the country's most desirable cities. But success has a way of masking dysfunction, and money can buy everything except genuine connection. Somewhere between our 10th and 12th anniversaries, Victoria and I had stopped being husband and wife, and started being business partners managing a shared enterprise called marriage. We coordinated schedules, split expenses, attended social functions together, and maintained the appearance of a thriving relationship. Yet the intimacy had evaporated so gradually that neither of us acknowledged its absence until it was too late to recover. The erosion happened in small increments. Conversations became status updates rather than genuine exchanges. Physical affection turned perfunctory, obligatory kisses goodbye and quick hugs before bed. We stopped laughing together, stopped staying up late talking about dreams and fears, stopped reaching for each other in the middle of the night. Instead, we became efficient roommates who happened to share a bank account and a mortgage. The house felt more like a beautifully appointed hotel where two strangers happened to be staying in the same suite. Romano's had been our place for every anniversary since our 3rd year of marriage. The same corner table overlooking Elliott Bay, the same waiter who remembered our names and preferences, the same ritual of toasting to another year together. Victoria had insisted we maintain the tradition even as everything else about our relationship had grown stale and predictable. She dressed carefully for these dinners, always in something new and elegant, and she played her role as the devoted wife with practiced perfection. Until tonight, when the performance finally cracked. She'd arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes late, which was unusual for someone as punctual as Victoria. Her makeup was slightly smudged around the eyes, as if she'd been crying earlier, and she carried herself with the tension of someone preparing for battle. During appetizers, she barely touched her food, pushing the arugula salad around her plate, while checking her phone repeatedly. I made conversation about a new property acquisition, about plans for the upcoming holiday season, about anything that might restore some normalcy to the evening. But her responses were clipped, distracted, as if she were mentally rehearsing lines for a speech I hadn't been given the script for. The champagne had been her idea. "Let's order the good stuff tonight," she'd said, flagging down our waiter. "Dom Perignon. We're celebrating 15 years." The irony wasn't lost on me, as I watched her drain her glass in 3 large gulps, then immediately pour another. Victoria wasn't much of a drinker under normal circumstances. She preferred wine with dinner, maybe 2 glasses maximum before switching to sparkling water. But tonight she was drinking like someone building courage for something difficult. When the entree arrived, she barely glanced at her seafood risotto before setting down her fork and fixing me with a stare I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger exactly, or sadness, but something closer to resolve. The kind of look someone gives you when they've already made a decision and are simply waiting for the right moment to execute it. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady despite the alcohol, "I need to tell you something." That's when I knew. The pattern recognition that served me so well in business kicked into overdrive, and suddenly every inconsistency from the past 4 months snapped into focus like puzzle pieces finding their proper places. The late nights at the office that didn't match her project deadlines, the weekend yoga retreats that required overnight stays in Portland, the new lingerie that never made an appearance in our bedroom, the way she'd started locking her phone and carrying it everywhere, even to the bathroom. The subtle changes in her grooming routine, the expensive new clothes, the unexplained charges on our credit card for restaurants I'd never heard of. I'd noticed all of it, cataloged it, analyzed it with the same systematic approach I used to evaluate investment opportunities. The data painted a clear picture, but like any good analyst, I'd waited for confirmation before drawing conclusions. Victoria was about to provide that confirmation in the most public way possible, and I was ready for it. She stood up then, the movement sudden enough to jostle the table and send champagne sloshing over the rim of her glass. That's when she made her announcement about being done with the marriage, her voice carrying clearly across the restaurant's hushed atmosphere. Other diners tried not to stare while obviously hanging on every word. Our waiter backed away slowly, clearly uncomfortable with the drama unfolding at table 12. The piano player, an elderly gentleman who'd been providing gentle background music, seemed to stumble over his melody as Victoria's words cut through the romantic ambiance like a fire alarm. "I can't do this anymore, Marcus," she continued, her voice growing louder and more theatrical with each word. "I can't pretend we're happy. I can't pretend this marriage means anything to either of us. I'm 41 years old, and I refuse to waste whatever good years I have left maintaining this charade." She gestured around the restaurant, at the other couples dining quietly, at the carefully set table between us. "Look at us. Really look at us. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you looked at me like you actually saw me? We're strangers, Marcus, expensive, well-dressed strangers who happen to share an address." She wasn't wrong about any of it. We had become strangers. We did maintain a charade. Our conversations had devolved into logistics and small talk. But what she didn't understand was that I'd accepted these realities months ago. I'd already done the emotional work of recognizing our marriage was over. I'd already begun the process of detaching, of protecting myself, of preparing for exactly this moment. Victoria thought she was delivering devastating news. Instead, she was confirming what I'd already concluded based on evidence she didn't know I'd collected. The smile that crossed my face wasn't cruel or mocking. It was the smile of a man who'd just watched a long-anticipated event finally unfold, like an analyst who'd predicted a market correction and watched it happen exactly as forecasted. There was no surprise, no shock, no devastating blow to absorb, just the quiet satisfaction of having read the situation correctly from the beginning. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly, reaching for my water glass and taking a measured sip. "We have become strangers. And you know what, Victoria, I'm okay with that." The simplicity of my response seemed to catch her off guard. She'd clearly expected anger, pleading, or at least some kind of emotional reaction. Instead, she got acknowledgement and acceptance, delivered in the same tone I might use to agree with her assessment of the weather. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, frustration, then something that looked almost like disappointment. She'd choreographed this scene expecting resistance, expecting me to fight for us, to make grand gestures or desperate promises. My calm agreement threw off her entire script. "That's it," she said, her voice rising again. "That's all you have to say."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"I just told you our marriage is over, and you're okay with it?" I set down my water glass and leaned back in my chair, studying her face in the candlelight. She looked beautiful, as she always did when she was passionate about something. Her cheeks were flushed from the champagne and emotion, her eyes bright with unshed tears, her whole being vibrating with the energy of someone who'd finally stopped holding back. But I also saw something else in her expression, something that confirmed every suspicion I'd harbored over the past 4 months. Guilt. Relief. And underneath it all, the look of someone who'd already moved on emotionally and was simply waiting for permission to make it official. Victoria, I said quietly, keeping my voice low enough that the neighboring tables couldn't overhear. If you're done with this marriage, then yes, I accept that. I'm not going to beg you to stay or promise to change or pretend that we can fix something that's been broken for years. You want honesty? Here it is. I've seen this coming for months. The late nights, the weekend trips, the way you've been pulling away. The way you've been living a separate life that doesn't include me. Her face went pale beneath her makeup. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the credit card charges at restaurants I've never been to. The hotel rooms in Portland when you were supposedly at yoga retreats. The new clothes, the new perfume, the way you guard your phone like it contains state secrets. I'm talking about the fact that you've been having an affair, and tonight is your way of making it official so you can stop feeling guilty about it. The accusation hung between us like smoke from an extinguished candle. Victoria's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again without any sound emerging. Around us the restaurant continued its elegant dance of service and conversation, but our corner table had become an island of tense silence. The piano player had moved on to a melancholy ballad that seemed to underscore the moment perfectly. I don't know what you think you know, she finally managed, but her voice lacked conviction. You're being paranoid, Marcus. Just because our marriage is struggling doesn't mean I'm having an affair. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone, opening the Photos app with deliberate slowness. For 4 months I'd been documenting everything, not out of spite or jealousy, but because my analytical nature demanded evidence to support theories. I'd photographed credit card statements, hotel receipts, restaurant charges, even the mileage on her car when she returned from supposed local events. I'd built a case file without consciously deciding to do so, simply because patterns demanded investigation. Should I show you the photos of the credit card statements? I asked quietly. The charges at Le Bernardin in Portland, on nights when you told me you were at the hotel spa, the flower purchases from Pike Place Market that never made it home, the parking receipts from locations that don't match any of the places you claim to be. I scrolled through the evidence slowly, letting her see enough to understand the scope of what I knew without making a scene that would embarrass us both further. Her face crumpled then, the carefully constructed facade finally giving way to something more honest. Marcus, you don't need to explain, I said, putting the phone away. You don't owe me confessions or apologies. You made your choice months ago. Tonight is just the official announcement. I signaled to our waiter who approached cautiously, clearly hoping to escape whatever domestic drama was unfolding at his station. Could we get the check, please? I asked politely, and perhaps a to-go container for the ladies' meal. Victoria stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. You're not angry? The question struck me as oddly naive. Of course I was angry, but not in the way she expected. I wasn't angry about the affair itself. If I'm being completely honest, our marriage had been dead long enough that her finding connection elsewhere felt more like inevitable than betrayal. I was angry about the deception, about being treated like I was too stupid to notice the obvious changes in her behavior. I was angry about being forced to play a role in a charade when we both knew the truth. But mostly, I was angry at how much time we'd both wasted pretending everything was fine when we could have addressed the problems honestly years ago. I'm disappointed, I said finally. Not surprised, but disappointed. Disappointed that you felt the need to sneak around instead of just talking to me. Disappointed that you chose to make this announcement in a restaurant full of strangers instead of having a private conversation at home. Disappointed that you've been living a double life for months when we could have handled this with dignity. The waiter returned with our check, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who'd clearly witnessed his share of relationship implosions at table 12. I handed him my credit card without looking at the total. Romano's had excellent food, but I suspected this would be our last meal here regardless of how the conversation ended. But angry in the way you want me to be angry? No, you've been gone for months, Victoria. Tonight you just made it official. I stood up and moved around to pull out her chair, a gesture of courtesy that seemed to confuse her even more. Shall we continue this conversation at home, or would you prefer to call it a night? She gathered her purse with shaking hands, her composure finally beginning to crack. Marcus, I need you to understand. I understand perfectly, I said, signing the receipt and pocketing my card. You fell out of love with me probably years ago. You found someone else who makes you feel the way I used to make you feel. You want out of this marriage, but you needed me to be the villain so you could feel better about leaving. The problem is, I'm not going to be your villain. I'm just going to be the husband who says yes when you ask for a divorce. The drive home to Bellevue was conducted in complete silence. Victoria stared out the passenger window at the lights of Seattle reflecting off Lake Washington, while I focused on the familiar route that would soon stop being our shared commute. The house appeared around the final curve exactly as we'd left it 3 hours earlier, its contemporary lines and expensive landscaping still projecting the image of success and stability. But like our marriage, the beautiful exterior masked fundamental problems that couldn't be fixed with better lighting or fresh paint. Inside, Victoria headed straight for the bar cart in our living room and poured herself 3 fingers of the Macallan we'd been saving for special occasions. Apparently, the dissolution of our marriage qualified as special. I loosened my tie and settled into the leather chair that had been my designated spot for evening reading and laptop work, watching her pace around the room like a caged animal looking for an exit. "His name is Alex," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if she'd been holding them back for too long. "He's a creative director at the agency we've been working with on the product launch. We started collaborating on campaigns back in March, and things just developed naturally. I didn't plan for it to happen, Marcus. I didn't wake up one day and decide to have an affair." I nodded slowly, processing this confirmation of what I'd already deduced. "How long?" 3 months, she admitted, taking a large sip of whiskey. "Maybe a little longer if you count the emotional connection before anything physical happened." She set down her glass and turned to face me fully. "I know how that sounds. I know it makes me the terrible person in this story. But I need you to understand that what we had was already over. The marriage was already dead. Alex didn't destroy anything that wasn't already destroyed. She wasn't entirely wrong, but she wasn't entirely right either. Our marriage had been struggling, certainly, but it wasn't irreparably broken until she made the decision to step outside it instead of trying to fix it. The moment she started sharing intimate thoughts with Alex, started looking forward to his messages more than conversations with me, started planning secret meetings and elaborate cover stories, she'd killed whatever chance we might have had to rebuild what we'd lost. "You're right that our marriage was struggling," I said carefully. "But it wasn't dead until you decided it was dead. There's a difference between having problems and giving up on solving them." I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the lake and the mountains beyond. "The question now isn't how we got here. The question is how we move forward with some dignity intact." Victoria joined me at the window, standing close enough that I could smell the perfume she'd started wearing 3 months ago. The expensive one that didn't smell like the Victoria I'd married but like someone trying to become a different version of herself. "What does that mean, exactly? Moving forward with dignity? It means we handle this like adults instead of children. It means we don't drag each other through the mud in divorce proceedings. It means we split our assets fairly, sell the house, and go our separate ways without trying to destroy each other in the process." I turned to look at her directly. "It means you get to be with Alex without having to paint me as an abusive monster to justify leaving, and I get to rebuild my life without having to defend myself against accusations that aren't true." She blinked hard and I realized she was fighting back tears. "You really aren't going to fight for us, are you?" The question hung between us like the last note of a song that's been playing too long. Victoria wanted me to fight not because she wanted to stay married but because my fighting would validate her decision to leave. If I begged and pleaded, and made desperate promises to change, she could tell herself and everyone else that she'd tried everything before giving up. My calm acceptance robbed her of that narrative. What exactly would I be fighting for? I asked gently. "A woman who's been emotionally and physically involved with another man for 3 months? A marriage where we've become strangers who share expenses? A relationship where we both go through the motions without any genuine connection?" I shook my head slowly. "Victoria, fighting implies there's something worth saving. What we have now isn't worth fighting for, and what we used to have is already gone." She finished her whiskey in one swallow and set the glass down on the window ledge with a sharp click. "I need some air," she said, sliding open the door to our deck. "I need to think." I watched her step outside into the cool Pacific Northwest evening, her silhouette framed against the lights across the lake. Part of me wanted to follow her, to have the dramatic confrontation she seemed to be craving, to give her the emotional scene that would make this whole situation feel more significant. But I'd learned something important in 18 years of real estate negotiations. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words, and calm confidence unsettles people more than anger ever could. Instead I went upstairs to my home office and opened my laptop. If Victoria wanted space to think, I'd give her that space, but I wasn't going to waste the time sitting around. I had work to do, properties to manage, and a life to plan that didn't include her. The sooner I started adapting to that reality, the better off I'd be. My phone buzzed with a text message around midnight, Victoria letting me know she was staying at her sister's place for the night and would be back tomorrow to talk more. I typed back a simple acknowledgement and went to bed in the king-size bed that had felt too big for just two people and would probably feel just right for one. The next morning brought clarity in the way that only a good night's sleep can provide. I woke up at 6:30, made coffee, and sat on the deck watching the sunrise paint the Cascade Mountains in shades of pink and gold. For the first time in months, the silence in the house felt peaceful instead of tense. No one was pretending to be asleep while checking their phone. No one was making small talk to fill uncomfortable gaps in conversation. No one was tiptoeing around subjects we weren't supposed to discuss. Victoria returned around 10 a.m., looking tired but determined. She'd changed clothes and fixed her makeup, but there was something different about her demeanor. The guilty, defensive energy from the night before had been replaced by something more straightforward. She poured herself coffee and joined me at the kitchen island where I was reviewing property reports on my tablet. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," she began, wrapping her hands around her mug like she was trying to warm them. "About handling this with dignity, about not destroying each other." She paused, studying my face as if trying to gauge my mood. "I want you to know that I never intended for things to happen the way they did. I never meant to hurt you." I looked up from my tablet, taking in Lortra Ornit's expression and carefully chosen words. Victoria had always been good at crafting messages. It was what made her successful in marketing. She knew how to find the right combination of words to achieve a desired outcome. This morning's speech felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced it during her sleepless night at her sister's house. "I appreciate that," I said simply, "and I want you to know that I don't see you as a villain in this story. People fall out of love. People find connection in unexpected places. It happens to millions of couples every year. What matters now is how we handle the transition." She nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "So what does that look like, practically speaking?" I set down my tablet and gave her my full attention. This was the conversation I'd been preparing for since I first started noticing the changes in her behavior. "First we contact lawyers, but we do it collaboratively instead of adversarially. We agree on the big picture before we bring in legal representation to handle the paperwork. Second, we put the house on the market immediately. Neither of us can afford to carry this mortgage alone, and there's no point in fighting over an asset we'll have to sell anyway." Victoria was taking notes on her phone, approaching the dissolution of our marriage with the same organizational skills she brought to marketing campaigns. "What about the investment accounts? The retirement funds?" "We split everything 50-50, I said without hesitation. No arguments, no negotiations, no attempts to claim I deserve more because I earned more or you deserve more because you did more of the household management. Clean split, clean break. I could see her surprise at how straightforward I was being. "Victoria, I make good money. You make good money. Neither of us is going to be financially devastated by this divorce. Fighting over assets would cost us more in legal fees than we'd gain in the settlement." She set down her phone and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years, something like respect, mixed with genuine curiosity. "You've really thought this through, haven't you?" "I've had 4 months to think it through," I admitted. 4 months to recognize that our marriage was ending, and prepare for what comes next. "Last night wasn't a surprise, Victoria, it was a confirmation." That afternoon, we called our respective sisters to break the news. Victoria's sister Emma had apparently spent the night providing emotional support and reinforcement for whatever decision Victoria wanted to make. My sister Lauren, always more direct, asked pointed questions about whether we'd tried counseling, whether this was really what we both wanted, and whether we were making decisions based on emotion or logic. I assured her that this was the right choice for both of us, though I didn't go into details about Alex or the months of deception that had led to this moment. By evening, we'd contacted a collaborative divorce attorney and scheduled our first meeting. We'd agreed on a realtor to list the house and a timeline for moving out. We'd even started the awkward process of dividing possessions, approaching it with the same systematic efficiency we'd once brought to planning vacations or organizing dinner parties. If someone had walked into our house that evening, they might have thought we were the most amicable divorcing couple in history. But underneath the practical cooperation, I was processing something more complex than Victoria probably realized. Relief certainly, that the pretending was finally over. Sadness for the good years we'd shared before everything fell apart. Anger at how unnecessarily complicated she'd made the ending by choosing deception over honesty. And underneath it all, a growing sense of anticipation for whatever came next. For the first time in years, I was looking forward to the future instead of just managing the present. I was excited about the possibility of finding someone who actually wanted to be with me, someone who wouldn't need to create elaborate lies to justify staying out all night. I was excited about living alone again, about making decisions without consulting someone who'd checked out of our partnership months ago. I was excited about rediscovering who Marcus Kellerman was when he wasn't trying to be half of a dysfunctional couple. Victoria seemed to be experiencing her own version of relief mixed with guilt. She was already making plans to spend more time with Alex, though she was careful not to mention him directly in my presence. Her phone was buzzing constantly with text messages that made her smile in ways I hadn't seen in months. She was lighter, more animated, more like the woman I'd fallen in love with 15 years ago, just pointed in a different direction. The house sold faster than either of us expected. 3 days on the market, 4 showings, 2 offers above asking price. Apparently contemporary homes with lake views were still in high demand even in an uncertain market. We accepted the higher offer and scheduled closing for 6 weeks out, which gave us time to find separate living arrangements and complete the legal paperwork. I found a downtown Seattle condo with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of Elliott Bay, modern, minimal, completely different from the suburban family home we'd shared. Victoria found a trendy apartment in Capitol Hill, walking distance from galleries and restaurants, and the kind of nightlife we'd stopped enjoying together years ago. We were both moving toward futures that reflected who we wanted to become rather than who we'd been together. The divorce proceedings moved with surprising speed and minimal drama. Our collaborative approach meant fewer billable hours for the lawyers and less emotional damage for both of us. We signed papers, transferred accounts, and divided assets with the same efficiency we'd once brought to planning home renovations. By the time our final court date arrived, the legal dissolution of our marriage felt like a formality rather than a traumatic event. Standing outside the courthouse on a crisp October afternoon, Victoria and I faced each other as ex-spouses for the first time. She looked different already, lighter somehow, dressed in clothes that were more vibrant and stylish than anything she'd worn in our final years together. I probably looked different too, more relaxed, more confident, definitely more optimistic about the future. "Thank you," she said simply, "for making this as easy as it could be, for not making me the villain, for letting me go without a fight." I smiled, the same knowing smile I'd given her that night at Romano's when she announced the end of our marriage. "Thank you for finally being honest about what you wanted. It took courage to blow up our life, even if you could have done it more gracefully." We shook hands like business partners concluding a successful transaction, which in many ways was exactly what we were. 15 years of marriage, reduced to a handshake and a stack of legal documents. It should have felt more significant, more devastating, more final. Instead, it felt like the natural conclusion to a story that had run its course. As I watched Victoria walk away toward the future she'd chosen, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. Not happiness about the divorce itself, but happiness about being free to build something new. Happiness about not having to pretend anymore. Happiness about the possibility of finding someone who would choose me actively and enthusiastically, instead of just tolerating my presence. I drove back to my new condo in downtown Seattle, taking the long way around Lake Washington to give myself time to process the transition. The afternoon sun was reflecting off the water, turning everything golden and optimistic. My phone had several missed calls and text messages from friends and family checking to see how I was handling the final court date. I'd call them back later, after I'd had time to settle into this new chapter. The condo was still sparsely furnished, still felt more like a hotel room than a home, but it was mine. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelves, every coffee mug in the kitchen cabinet reflected my choices and nobody else's. For the first time in 15 years, I was living a life that didn't require compromise or negotiation or careful diplomacy to avoid conflict. I opened a bottle of wine, something expensive that I'd been saving for a special occasion, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching ferries cross Elliott Bay. The city stretched out below me, full of possibilities and strangers and opportunities for connection I couldn't have imagined when I was married. I raised my glass in a silent toast to endings that make room for beginnings, to the courage it takes to admit when something isn't working, and to the wisdom that comes from letting go gracefully. The divorce was final, the chapter was closed, and I was ready to see what the next story would bring. Victoria had announced she was done with our marriage, and I'd smiled because I was done too. Sometimes the best response to someone leaving is holding the door open and wishing them well on their way out. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to fight for something that no longer serves either of you. Sometimes freedom looks exactly like saying yes when someone asks you to let them go. 3 months later, I would meet Sarah at a real estate investment conference in Portland. 6 months after that, Victoria would get engaged to Alex. A year later, I'd look back on that anniversary dinner at Romano's as the night my real life finally began. But that night, standing in my new condo with wine and city lights and unlimited possibilities stretching out before me, all I knew was that I'd made the right choice. I'd chosen dignity over drama, grace over revenge, and freedom over the desperate attempt to hold on to something that was already gone. The smile I'd given Victoria that night hadn't been cruel or bitter. It had been the smile of a man who'd finally stopped pretending and was ready to start living authentically again. And that, I realized, was worth celebrating. The text message arrived at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after our final court date. I was reviewing quarterly reports for a mixed-use development in Tacoma when my phone lit up with Victoria's name. The message was brief and unexpected. "Marcus, I need to see you. It's important. Can we meet tomorrow?" I stared at the screen for a long moment, wondering what could possibly be urgent enough to warrant breaking the clean separation we'd maintained since the divorce was finalized. I'd been thriving in my new life downtown. The condo had transformed from a sterile hotel room into a sophisticated bachelor pad that actually felt like home. I'd bought real furniture, hung artwork that reflected my taste rather than compromise, and established routines that revolved around my preferences alone. Morning coffee on the balcony overlooking Elliott Bay, evening workouts at the gym in my building, weekend exploration of Seattle neighborhoods I'd never bothered to visit when I was married. For the first time in years, I felt like myself instead of half of an ill-fitting couple. The real estate market had been kind to me in the months following the divorce. I'd closed on 2 significant acquisitions, a historic office building in Pioneer Square and a retail complex in Fremont that I was converting to mixed residential and commercial use. Work had become more than just a career, it had become a creative outlet and a source of genuine satisfaction. Without the constant undercurrent of marital tension, I found myself taking calculated risks and pursuing opportunities I might have avoided when I had to consider Victoria's opinions and concerns about everything. My social life had evolved naturally without any forced efforts to get back out there. Former colleagues who'd kept their distance during the messy final year began inviting me to industry events and casual dinners. I'd reconnected with old friends who'd gradually faded from our social circle as Victoria and I had become increasingly insular and dysfunctional. There were no dramatic nights of drowning my sorrows or desperate attempts to prove my desirability to random strangers, just a gradual expansion of connections and activities that felt authentic rather than performative. I responded to Victoria's message the next morning after my usual coffee and market analysis routine. "Sure, what time and where?" Her reply came within minutes, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill, not far from her new apartment. The location choice felt deliberate, somewhere in her territory rather than neutral ground, which made me curious about what she wanted to discuss. The coffee shop was exactly the kind of place Victoria would choose for this conversation. Exposed brick walls, mismatched vintage furniture, baristas with elaborate tattoos and carefully curated facial hair. The clientele was young, artistic, dramatically different from the corporate crowd we'd socialized with when we were married. I spotted her immediately at a corner table, looking more vibrant and stylish than I'd seen her in years. Her hair was shorter, more modern, and she was wearing the kind of bold jewelry she'd always admired but never felt confident enough to wear when we were together. She stood to greet me with an awkward half-hug that felt like muscle memory from a different lifetime. Up close, she looked healthy and rested, with the kind of glow that comes from living authentically, rather than maintaining appearances. Whatever stress and guilt had been eating at her during the final months of our marriage had clearly been resolved by the freedom to be honest about her choices. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, settling back into her chair. "I know this is strange, reaching out after we agreed to keep things clean between us." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, a nervous gesture I remembered from countless conversations over 15 years of marriage. But something happened that I thought you should know about directly, rather than hearing it through mutual friends or social media. I leaned back in my chair, maintaining the same calm composure that had served me well throughout our divorce proceedings. Whatever Victoria needed to tell me, I was prepared to handle it with the same dignity and grace that had gotten me through the end of our marriage. "What's going on?" She took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts or perhaps her courage. "Alex proposed to me last weekend. We're engaged." The words hung between us for a moment, neither shocking nor particularly emotional, just information that needed to be processed and responded to appropriately. I felt no surge of jealousy or anger, or even disappointment. If anything, I felt a kind of satisfied vindication. Victoria had moved from our marriage directly into another serious relationship, which confirmed everything I'd suspected about the timeline of her emotional departure from our life together. She hadn't left me for the possibility of something better, she'd left me for something specific that was already well developed before she found the courage to make it official. "Congratulations," I said simply, and I meant it. "I hope you're happy together." The sincerity in my voice seemed to catch her off guard, as if she'd been bracing for a different kind of reaction. "That's it?" she asked, echoing the same question she'd posed that night at Romano's when I'd smiled instead of falling apart. "You're not upset? You don't think it's too soon?" I considered her questions while studying her face across the small table. Victoria looked genuinely puzzled by my lack of drama, as if my calm acceptance somehow diminished the significance of her announcement. She'd clearly expected this revelation to carry more emotional weight, to provoke some kind of response that would validate her decision-making process or confirm her importance in my life. "Victoria, you and Alex have been together for over 6 months if we're counting from when you first started confiding in him instead of me. You were emotionally married to him long before you were legally divorced from me." I took a sip of my coffee, choosing my words carefully to avoid cruelty while maintaining honesty. "The fact that you're making it official isn't surprising. It's logical." Her face went through a series of expressions, processing my matter-of-fact response to what she'd clearly expected to be devastating news. "You're not even a little bit hurt that I'm marrying someone else less than 6 months after our divorce was final?" The question revealed more about Victoria's mindset than she probably intended. She wanted me to be hurt, not because she enjoyed causing pain, but because my pain would validate her choices and confirm her continued importance in my emotional landscape. My indifference was more unsettling to her than anger would have been, because it suggested that I'd moved on more completely than she'd anticipated. "Would you prefer that I be hurt?" I asked gently. "Would my emotional devastation make you feel better about your choices? Because if that's what you need to hear, I can tell you that yes, there's a part of me that wishes our marriage could have been saved. There's a part of me that's sad about the years we wasted being incompatible instead of addressing our problems honestly. But hurt about you marrying Alex? No, I want you to be happy, and if Alex makes you happy in ways I never could, then I'm genuinely glad you found each other." Victoria's eyes filled with tears, though I wasn't sure if they were tears of relief, disappointment, or something more complex. "You're being so gracious about this. More gracious than I deserve, considering how I handled everything." I leaned forward slightly, meeting her gaze directly. "Victoria, we're divorced. You get to marry whoever you want, whenever you want, for whatever reasons make sense to you. You don't need my permission or my blessing or my emotional breakdown to validate your choices. You're free, completely and legally free, to build whatever life makes you happiest." She wiped at her eyes with a napkin, smudging her carefully applied mascara. "I guess I expected you to be angrier, or more bitter. Most of my friends can't believe how well you've handled all of this." That comment piqued my interest. Victoria's friends had been discussing my response to our divorce, which meant they'd been discussing me in general. I wondered what narrative Victoria had constructed about our split, and my role in it, especially given my refusal to play the villain she'd seemed to want me to be. "What exactly have you told your friends about our divorce?" I asked, genuinely curious about how she'd explained the situation to her support network. Victoria shifted in her chair, suddenly looking uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Just that we grew apart, that we wanted different things, that it was mutual and amicable." She paused, clearly editing her thoughts before continuing. "Some of them think you must be hiding your feelings better than most men. They can't believe any husband would be so calm about his wife leaving him for another man." I almost smiled at the irony. Victoria's friends were giving me credit for emotional stoicism when the reality was much simpler. I wasn't hiding devastation behind a mask of composure. I genuinely wasn't devastated. The marriage had been over long before Victoria made it official, and I'd had months to process that reality while she was still pretending we had a future together. Maybe I'm just better at accepting reality than most men, I said. Or maybe I'd already done the emotional work of letting go before you asked for the divorce. Either way, I'm not performing strength for anyone's benefit. This is just how I actually feel about the situation. Victoria studied my face as if trying to detect cracks in my composure that would reveal hidden pain. When she didn't find what she was looking for, her expression shifted to something that looked almost like admiration mixed with confusion. I don't think I ever really knew you, did I? Not the real you, underneath all the politeness and accommodation. The observation was more insightful than I'd expected from someone who'd spent years not really seeing me at all. Victoria was right that she'd never known the real me, but not because I'd been hiding behind masks. She'd never known me because she'd never been particularly interested in knowing me. She'd been content with the version of Marcus that paid bills and attended social functions and didn't cause problems. The deeper questions about what I actually wanted, what I dreamed about, what excited or frustrated or inspired me, had never been part of our conversational repertoire. I think we both settled for surface-level knowledge of each other, I said diplomatically. We knew each other's routines and preferences and pet peeves, but we stopped being curious about each other's inner lives years ago. That's probably more common in long marriages than either of us wants to admit. She nodded slowly, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug again. Alex asks me things you never asked, about my hopes and fears and what I think about when I'm driving alone. He's interested in parts of me that you never seem to notice. The comment should have stung, but instead it felt like confirmation of something I'd suspected for years. Victoria and I had been fundamentally incompatible in ways that had nothing to do with character flaws or moral failures. We'd simply been two people who brought out each other's most surface-level, least interesting qualities. With Alex, she was apparently rediscovering parts of herself that had been dormant during our marriage. That was actually a beautiful thing, even if it meant the end of our relationship. I'm glad he sees you in ways I couldn't, I said, and meant it. Everyone deserves to be with someone who's genuinely curious about who they are underneath the daily routine. I hope you two have that kind of connection for decades to come. Victoria's tears started again, more freely this time. You're making this so much harder by being so understanding. I was prepared for you to be angry, or bitter, or to tell me I was making a mistake. I wasn't prepared for you to wish me well and mean it. I handed her my napkin since hers was already mascara-stained. Victoria, what would be the point of being angry or bitter? You found someone who makes you happy in ways I never could. That's not a tragedy, it's actually the best possible outcome for both of us. I get to find someone who's genuinely excited about being with me, and you get to be with someone who appreciates parts of you that I never fully understood. She wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. Are you seeing anyone? Dating, I mean. The question felt loaded, though I wasn't sure with what. Victoria might have been genuinely curious about my romantic life, or she might have been fishing for information that would help her gauge how well I was really handling our divorce. Either way, I saw no reason to be anything other than honest. I've been on a few dates, nothing serious yet. I'm taking my time figuring out what I actually want in a relationship now that I'm not trying to make something work that was fundamentally broken. I paused, considering how much to reveal. It's been interesting, discovering what I'm attracted to when I'm not filtering everything through the lens of trying to save a failing marriage. Victoria's expression shifted to something that looked suspiciously like jealousy, which struck me as hypocritical given that she was sitting across from me wearing an engagement ring from another man. Anyone I would know? I shook my head. No one from our social circle. I've mostly been meeting people through work events or introductions from friends you never met. It's been good, having romantic possibilities that don't come with complicated history or mutual acquaintances who feel obligated to take sides. She processed this information with visible discomfort, which told me that despite her engagement to Alex, some part of her wasn't entirely ready for me to move on. Victoria wanted me to be gracious about her choices, but she also wanted me to remain emotionally available as a backup option, or at least as someone whose life was diminished by her absence. My casual mention of dating other women disrupted that narrative. Well, she said finally, I hope you find someone wonderful, Someone who appreciates how steady and thoughtful you are." The words sounded forced, as if she was trying to convince herself to mean them. I finished my coffee and checked my watch. The conversation had served its purpose. Victoria had delivered her news and I'd responded with appropriate grace, but there was no reason to extend the interaction unnecessarily. We'd covered the important ground and established that we could interact civilly when circumstances required it, but we weren't friends, and we weren't going to become friends. "I should probably head back to the office," I said, standing and reaching for my wallet. "Thank you for telling me about the engagement in person instead of letting me hear it through the grapevine. That was considerate." Victoria stood as well, looking smaller somehow than she had when I'd first arrived. "Marcus, can I ask you something? Do you think we ever had a chance, if we'd tried counseling or communication, or worked harder at being honest with each other?" The question hung between us like smoke from a candle that had been extinguished too late to save the tablecloth. It was the kind of question that could only be asked after a relationship had ended, when the answer couldn't change anything but might provide some closure or understanding. I considered my response carefully, weighing honesty against kindness. "I think we had a chance in the early years, before we settled into patterns that brought out each other's worst qualities. But by the time we should have been seeking help, we'd already stopped being curious about each other. We'd already started living parallel lives that happened to share an address." I paused, making sure my next words came out gently. "I think you and I are both better people apart than we were together. That's not anyone's fault, it's just incompatibility that we were too polite to acknowledge for too long." Victoria nodded slowly, processing this assessment of our failed marriage. "I think you're right. I think we were trying so hard to be good spouses that we forgot to be authentic people. With Alex, I feel like myself again. I hope you find someone who makes you feel like yourself too." We hugged goodbye outside the coffee shop, a brief, civilized embrace that marked the end of our personal relationship and the beginning of whatever distant polite acknowledgement we'd maintain if we encountered each other in the future. As I walked back to my car, I felt the same sense of closure and relief that had characterized most of my interactions with Victoria since she'd first announced her intention to leave. The drive back to downtown Seattle gave me time to process the conversation and what it revealed about both Victoria's mindset and my own emotional state. She'd clearly expected the engagement announcement to carry more weight, to provoke more reaction, to maintain her position as someone whose choices could still affect my emotional well-being. My calm acceptance had disrupted that expectation and forced her to confront the reality that I'd moved on more completely than she'd anticipated. For my part, the conversation had confirmed something I'd been gradually realizing over the months since our divorce. I felt no lingering attachment to Victoria or nostalgia for our life together. The marriage had been a chapter in my life that had run its course naturally, like a job I'd outgrown or a hobby I'd lost interest in. There was no bitterness, because there was no sense of loss, just recognition that we'd been incompatible people who tried to force a connection that had never been sustainable. Back at my office, I threw myself into work with renewed energy. The afternoon brought a conference call with investors interested in a waterfront development opportunity in Bellingham, followed by a site visit to the Pioneer Square building I was renovating. The rhythm of problem-solving and deal-making felt more satisfying than ever, partly because I was no longer dividing my attention between work and the emotional management required to maintain a failing marriage. My assistant knocked on my office door around 4:30 with a stack of contracts requiring review and signature. Jennifer had worked for me for 3 years and had witnessed the gradual deterioration of my marriage from her unique vantage point as someone who scheduled my days and fielded my calls. She'd never commented directly on my personal life, but I'd noticed her becoming more efficient and proactive in the months since my divorce, as if my improved mood had made her job more enjoyable. "The Bellingham investors want to schedule a site visit for next week," she said, setting the contracts on my desk. "And Sarah Chen from the Portland Development Conference called to confirm your dinner meeting tomorrow night." Sarah Chen. I'd met her 6 weeks earlier at a real estate investment conference in Portland, where she'd given a presentation on sustainable development practices in urban environments. She was an architect and developer who specialized in converting historic buildings to mixed-use properties, work that aligned perfectly with several projects in my current portfolio. Our initial conversation had been purely professional, but it had evolved into something more personal over a series of phone calls and emails that had nothing to do with business. She was intelligent, ambitious, and genuinely passionate about her work in ways that reminded me how attractive competence could be. More importantly, she seemed interested in me as a complete person, rather than just as a successful businessman who could provide financial security and social status. Our conversations ranged from architecture and urban planning to books and travel, and the kind of philosophical questions Victoria and I had stopped exploring years before we divorced. "Confirm the dinner with Sarah," I told Jennifer, "and see if the Bellingham group can do the site visit on Thursday. I'd like to get moving on that project before winter weather complicates the timeline." Jennifer made notes and headed back to her desk, leaving me alone with the contracts and the growing anticipation I felt whenever Sarah's name came up. Tomorrow's dinner would be our first in-person meeting since the conference, and I was looking forward to it with an enthusiasm I hadn't felt about a social engagement in years. The evening passed quietly in my condo, with takeout from a Thai restaurant and a bottle of wine I'd been saving for no particular occasion. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows watching ferries cross Elliott Bay, while processing the day's conversations and revelations. Victoria's engagement to Alex felt like the final punctuation mark on our relationship, the official confirmation that we'd both moved forward into lives that suited us better than our marriage ever had. There was something liberating about having that conversation behind us, about knowing that Victoria was genuinely happy and committed to someone else. It eliminated any lingering possibility of reconciliation or second-guessing, any nagging doubt about whether I'd given up too easily on something worth saving. The clarity was refreshing after years of uncertainty and pretending. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah confirming our dinner plans and mentioning her excitement about seeing Seattle's architecture from someone who knew the city well. The message was warm and enthusiastic without being overly familiar, striking exactly the right tone for someone I was still getting to know but increasingly attracted to. I typed back a response, suggesting a restaurant in Belltown with views of the sound and architecture that would interest someone in her field. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on how different my life felt compared to this time last year, when I was still married to Victoria, and pretending that our relationship problems were temporary and fixable. The man who'd been tiptoeing around conflict and accommodating someone else's emotional needs at the expense of his own authentic desires, felt like a stranger to me now. In his place was someone more confident, more selective, more willing to pursue what he actually wanted instead of what seemed safe or socially acceptable. The next evening arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made Seattle feel like the most beautiful city in the world. I'd chosen a restaurant called Altura in Belltown, a place with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound and modern design elements that would appeal to someone with Sarah's aesthetic sensibilities. I arrived 15 minutes early and requested a table with water views, wanting everything to be perfect for what felt like an important evening. Sarah arrived precisely on time, looking professional yet approachable in a way that reminded me why I'd been drawn to her at the conference. She wore a navy blazer over dark jeans with boots that suggested someone who was equally comfortable in boardrooms and construction sites. Her confidence was immediately apparent in the way she moved through the restaurant and greeted me with genuine warmth. "Marcus," she said, accepting the chair I pulled out for her, "this place is gorgeous. The lines are so clean, and that view is spectacular." She gestured toward the windows where the Olympic Mountains were silhouetted against the sunset. "Thank you for choosing somewhere I could geek out about the architecture." We spent the first part of dinner discussing her flight from Portland, the projects she was currently managing, and the differences between development challenges in our respective cities. The conversation flowed easily, without the careful navigation of sensitive topics that had characterized my interactions with Victoria in our final years together. Sarah was direct without being aggressive, opinionated without being inflexible, and curious about perspectives that differed from her own. "Tell me about your Pioneer Square project," she said over the main course. "Historic preservation in that neighborhood must be incredibly complex given the infrastructure challenges and preservation requirements." I found myself describing not just the technical aspects of the renovation, but the vision behind it, the way I imagined the building serving the community while honoring its architectural heritage. Sarah asked thoughtful questions and offered insights based on similar projects she'd managed, but she also seemed genuinely interested in my thought process and creative problem-solving approach. "You talk about buildings the way some people talk about art," she observed, "like they have personalities and stories to tell. I love that perspective. The comment caught me off guard because Victoria had never shown interest in the creative aspects of my work. She'd been supportive of my career success and financial achievements, but she'd never been curious about what excited me intellectually or creatively about real estate development. Having someone notice and appreciate that dimension of my professional life felt unexpectedly meaningful. I suppose I do see buildings as having personalities, I admitted. Each property has its own challenges and possibilities, its own history and potential future. The work is part puzzle solving, part archaeology, part fortune telling. You're trying to honor what came before while creating something sustainable for what comes next. Sarah smiled, and I noticed the way her eyes lit up when she was genuinely engaged with an idea. That's exactly how I feel about historic preservation work. You're not just renovating a building, you're continuing a conversation that started decades or centuries ago. You're adding your voice to an ongoing story. The dinner conversation ranged from architecture and development to travel and books and personal philosophies about work-life balance. Sarah had spent 2 years working in Barcelona early in her career and spoke passionately about how European approaches to urban planning had influenced her thinking about American cities. She asked about my experience living in Seattle versus other places I'd considered, and I found myself describing not just the practical advantages but the emotional connection I felt to the Pacific Northwest landscape. Have you always been this thoughtful about your choices? She asked over dessert. Career, location, lifestyle decisions. You seem very intentional about creating a life that reflects your actual values rather than just following conventional expectations. The question touched on something I'd been thinking about frequently since my divorce. I think I've become more intentional in recent years, I said carefully. I spent my 30s trying to build what I thought success was supposed to look like, and I realized that external validation isn't the same thing as personal fulfillment.
Now I'm more interested in making choices that feel authentic to who I actually am rather than who I think I should be. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. That's a hard lesson to learn, but probably an important one. I see so many people in our industry who achieve everything they thought they wanted and then realize they were chasing someone else's definition of success. As the evening wound down, we walked along the waterfront near the restaurant, continuing our conversation under the city lights reflected in Elliott Bay. The chemistry between us was undeniable but not overwhelming, the kind of mutual attraction that builds gradually rather than exploding in a single moment. We talked easily, laughed often, and found ourselves discovering common interests and compatible perspectives on everything from urban planning to weekend hobbies. This has been wonderful, Sarah said as we reached her rental car. I feel like I could talk with you for hours about anything and everything. That's rare. I felt the same way, but I didn't want to seem too eager or intense for someone I was still getting to know. I've really enjoyed this too. Your perspective on sustainable development has me thinking about approaches I hadn't considered for some of my upcoming projects. She smiled, clearly recognizing that we were both being slightly formal despite the obvious connection between us. Would you be interested in continuing this conversation sometime soon? I'm coming back to Seattle in 2 weeks for a project meeting, and I'd love to see more of the city with someone who knows it well. I felt a surge of anticipation that reminded me how long it had been since I'd looked forward to seeing someone again. I'd like that very much. I know some places that would interest an architect, and I'd enjoy showing you around. We exchanged contact information and confirmed tentative plans for her next visit. As I watched her drive away, I realized I was smiling in a way that felt completely natural and unforced. For the first time since my divorce, I was excited about the possibility of building something meaningful with someone new, someone who seemed genuinely interested in who I was rather than what I could provide. The drive back to my condo was filled with reflection on how different this felt from the careful negotiations that had characterized my relationship with Victoria. With Sarah, conversation felt like exploration rather than diplomacy. I found myself wanting to share thoughts and experiences I'd kept private for years, wanting to learn about her perspectives and experiences, wanting to discover what we might build together if we continued getting to know each other. Back in my apartment, I poured a glass of wine and stood at the windows overlooking the city. The lights of Seattle stretched out below me, full of possibilities and connections I was only beginning to explore. Victoria's engagement announcement that morning felt like ancient history already, a reminder of a chapter that had concluded naturally rather than a loss that required mourning.
I thought about the contrast between my lunch with Victoria and my dinner with Sarah, between conversations that felt like performing old scripts and conversations that felt like genuine discovery. With Victoria, I'd felt like I was managing her expectations and protecting myself from disappointment. With Sarah, I felt like I was presenting my authentic self and being met with genuine interest and appreciation. The difference wasn't just about the end of one relationship and the beginning of another, it was about the difference between trying to force compatibility and finding natural alignment. Victoria and I had spent years trying to make our personalities and preferences and life goals fit together like puzzle pieces from different boxes. With Sarah, even after just one evening, I sensed the kind of organic compatibility that doesn't require constant negotiation and compromise. As I prepared for bed, I felt grateful for the journey that had brought me to this point. The pain and uncertainty of watching my marriage deteriorate, the difficult conversations and legal proceedings of divorce, the months of rebuilding my life as a single man, all of it had been necessary preparation for whatever came next. I was no longer the man who'd settled for surface-level connection and avoided difficult conversations. I was someone who knew what he wanted and was willing to pursue it authentically. Victoria's announcement that she was marrying Alex had been intended to test my emotional response, to gauge whether I was still invested in our shared history. Instead, it had confirmed that I'd moved forward completely, that I was ready for new experiences and connections that didn't require reference to what had come before. The smile I'd given her at Romano's that night when she announced the end of our marriage had been genuine then, and it felt even more justified now. I fell asleep thinking about Sarah's laugh and the way she'd listened when I talked about my work, the way she'd shared her own passions without apologizing for her enthusiasm. Tomorrow would bring new projects and challenges and opportunities, but tonight I felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd learned to choose quality over convenience, authenticity over accommodation, and hope over resignation. The future felt full of possibilities I was actually excited to explore. 2 years later, I stood in the same restaurant where Victoria had announced the end of our marriage. Romano's hadn't changed much, still the same corner table overlooking Elliott Bay, still the same piano player performing gentle melodies for couples celebrating milestones, but everything else was different. This time I wasn't the man receiving devastating news, I was the man about to propose to the woman who'd shown me what genuine partnership actually looked like. Sarah sat across from me, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the candlelight or expensive wine. She was telling me about her latest project, a historic theater renovation in Portland that was combining her passion for preservation with innovative sustainable design. Her eyes lit up as she described the technical challenges and creative solutions, the same enthusiasm that had first attracted me to her 2 years earlier. Watching her speak, I marveled at how different this felt from my final anniversary dinner with Victoria. With Victoria, conversations had felt like performance art, both of us playing roles we'd grown tired of but didn't know how to abandon. With Sarah, every discussion felt like collaboration, two minds genuinely interested in understanding each other's perspectives and building something together. She challenged my ideas without dismissing them, supported my ambitions while maintaining her own, and brought out aspects of my personality that Victoria had never seen, because I'd never felt safe enough to reveal them. "Marcus, you're being unusually quiet tonight," Sarah observed, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "Is everything all right? You seem distracted, but in a good way, if that makes sense." I smiled, feeling the weight of the engagement ring in my jacket pocket. We'd been together for 18 months, living together for 6, and building the kind of relationship I hadn't known was possible during my marriage. Sarah and I didn't just coexist, we actively chose each other every day. We traveled together, worked on projects together, navigated disagreements with respect and genuine curiosity about each other's positions. Most importantly, we'd created a partnership where both of us felt seen and valued for who we actually were. "I've been thinking about timing," I said, choosing my words carefully. "About how sometimes the right thing happens at exactly the right moment, even when you're not expecting it." Sarah tilted her head, studying my expression with the same analytical attention she brought to architectural plans. "That's very philosophical for a Tuesday night. Are we talking about work timing or life timing?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text message. I almost ignored it, but something made me glance at the screen. Victoria's name appeared with a message that made me pause. "Saw the article about your Bellingham project in Seattle Met. Congratulations. You've built something beautiful."
I showed the message to Sarah, who read it with the calm curiosity that characterized her approach to most things. We discussed Victoria many times, and Sarah understood the history without feeling threatened by it. She'd even met Victoria briefly at a charity event 6 months earlier, where they'd had a perfectly civil conversation about urban planning that left me amazed at how mature adults could handle complex social situations. "That's nice of her to reach out," Sarah said simply. "The Bellingham project is incredible. You should be proud of what you've accomplished." The ease with which Sarah handled Victoria's message reminded me of all the reasons I wanted to marry her. No drama, no insecurity, no need to make someone else's gesture about herself. Just genuine acknowledgement that people from our past could wish us well without threatening our present. It was a level of emotional maturity I'd never experienced in a romance. "Sarah," I said, pulling the ring box from my pocket and setting it on the table between us, "I love you. I love the way you think about problems and the way you celebrate solutions. I love how you make me want to be a better version of myself without making me feel like the current version isn't enough. I love that you see possibilities I miss and support dreams I haven't even articulated yet." Her hand went to her mouth, eyes widening as she processed what was happening. Around us, other diners began to notice the scene unfolding at our table, but I was focused entirely on Sarah's reaction. "I want to build a life with you that's based on choice rather than obligation, on excitement rather than resignation, on genuine partnership rather than convenient coexistence. Will you marry me?" Sarah stared at the ring box for a long moment, then looked up at me with tears in her eyes and a smile that outshone every light in the restaurant. "Yes," she said simply. "Absolutely yes." I slipped the ring onto her finger as other diners began to applaud, the same kind of attention Victoria and I had attracted 2 years earlier for very different reasons, but this time, the public nature of the moment felt celebratory rather than humiliating. This time I was offering something beautiful instead of accepting something broken. As we walked along the waterfront after dinner, Sarah admiring her engagement ring in the lamplight, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The man who'd signed divorce papers without argument had been protecting himself from further damage, but he'd also been preparing for something better. The man who'd smiled when his wife announced she was done with their marriage had been smiling because he'd already recognized that ending was the beginning of something far more meaningful. "I have a confession," Sarah said, stopping to face me near the spot where we'd said goodnight after our first dinner together. "I've been hoping you'd propose for months, not because I was impatient but because I've never been more certain about anything in my life. You're exactly the partner I dreamed of but didn't think actually existed." The honesty in her voice reminded me of all the ways this relationship differed from my marriage. With Victoria, I'd spent years guessing what she really thought, trying to decode subtle signals and unspoken expectations. With Sarah, communication was direct and generous. She told me what she wanted, appreciated what I offered, and trusted me to do the same. 6 months later, we were married in a small ceremony overlooking Puget Sound, surrounded by friends and family who genuinely celebrated our union. Victoria sent a thoughtful card wishing us happiness, signed by both her and Alex. There was no awkwardness, no lingering tension, just the recognition that we'd all moved forward into lives that suited us better than our previous arrangements. During the reception, my sister Lauren pulled me aside for a private moment. "I have to tell you, Marcus, I never saw you this relaxed and happy when you were married before. You look like yourself again, but a better version." She was right. The man standing in my wedding photos with Sarah looked confident and genuine in ways the man in my wedding photos with Victoria never had. I wasn't performing the role of happy husband, I actually was a happy husband. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. That evening, as Sarah and I danced to music that actually meant something to both of us, I thought about the smile I'd given Victoria that night at Romano's when she'd announced the end of our marriage. At the time, it had been the smile of a man who'd seen the ending coming and was ready for it. Now I understood it had also been the smile of a man who knew something better was waiting, even if he couldn't yet see what that would look like. The final lesson came not from the divorce itself, but from what followed. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is let them go gracefully. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is refuse to fight for something that's already over. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is trust that endings create space for beginnings you can't yet imagine. Victoria had announced she was done with our marriage, expecting drama and devastation. Instead, she'd gotten dignity and acceptance, which had allowed both of us to move forward without bitterness or regret.
2 years later, we were both happily remarried to people who appreciated us in ways we'd never appreciated each other. Standing on the balcony of my condo that night after the wedding, Sarah beside me in her beautiful dress, I felt grateful for every decision that had led to this moment. The smile I'd given Victoria hadn't been cruel or bitter. It had been the smile of a man who understood that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise, and sometimes the best response to someone leaving is simply holding the door open and trusting that something better is waiting on the other side. 5 years had passed since that night at Romano's, when Victoria announced the end of our marriage. I found myself thinking about it occasionally, not with regret or longing, but with the kind of detached curiosity you might feel when looking at old photographs of a house you used to live in. The memories were real, but they belonged to a different version of myself, someone I barely recognized anymore. The real estate development firm Sarah and I had started together was thriving beyond our initial projections. Kellerman Chen Development had completed 12 projects in the Pacific Northwest, each one reflecting our shared commitment to sustainable design and historic preservation. Working with my wife had revealed dimensions of partnership I'd never experienced during my marriage to Victoria. With Sarah, professional collaboration enhanced our personal relationship rather than competing with it. Our latest project, a mixed-use development in Bellingham that converted a defunct textile mill into artist studios and residential lofts, had just been featured in Architectural Digest. The article included photos of Sarah and me reviewing blueprints in the construction trailer, both of us wearing hard hats and safety vests, completely absorbed in problem-solving discussions. Looking at those images, I saw two people who genuinely enjoyed working together, who brought out each other's best professional qualities while maintaining clear boundaries between work and personal life. Victoria had reached out 6 months earlier when the article was first published, sending a brief message of congratulations that struck exactly the right tone. Warm but not intrusive, acknowledging our success without trying to insert herself into our current life. She and Alex had moved to Portland, where she'd started her own marketing consultancy specializing in sustainable businesses. According to mutual friends, they seemed genuinely happy together, the kind of settled contentment that comes from being with someone who appreciates your authentic self. The contrast between my two marriages became clearer with each passing year. With Victoria, I'd felt like I was constantly auditioning for the role of husband, trying to meet expectations that were never clearly articulated, but somehow always fell short. With Sarah, marriage felt like a daily choice we both made enthusiastically, a partnership that enhanced our individual lives rather than diminishing them. Sarah understood my need for quiet mornings and solo time to process complex projects. I understood her tendency to work late when inspiration struck and her need for creative spaces that reflected her aesthetic vision. We'd learned to support each other's professional ambitions without sacrificing our personal connection, something Victoria and I had never managed despite years of trying. The financial success of our development company had exceeded even my optimistic projections, but money wasn't the most meaningful measure of what we'd built together. The real achievement was the way we'd created a life that felt sustainable and authentic, where neither of us had to pretend to be someone we weren't in order to maintain harmony. Our home, a renovated Craftsman in Capitol Hill that we'd redesigned together, perfectly captured our shared aesthetic while accommodating our different working styles. Sarah's architecture studio occupied the converted garage, with floor-to-ceiling windows and custom storage for her drawings and models. My office was located in what had been the formal dining room, with built-in shelving for real estate documents and a view of the garden Sarah had designed with native Pacific Northwest plants. The house felt like a genuine collaboration in ways our old suburban home with Victoria never had. Every design decision reflected conversations and compromises that honored both our preferences, creating spaces that felt intentional rather than generic. We'd hosted dinner parties for friends and colleagues, and the feedback was always the same. The house felt warm and welcoming, like a place where people actually lived rather than just displayed their success. Last month we'd received news that Sarah was pregnant. The pregnancy had been planned and anticipated, but the reality of becoming parents together felt both thrilling and daunting. We'd spent hours discussing our hopes and concerns about raising children, the kind of deep conversations about values and priorities that Victoria and I had somehow never managed to have during 15 years of marriage. Sarah approached impending motherhood with the same thoughtful analysis she brought to her architecture projects. She'd researched everything from birthing options to childcare philosophies, but she also maintained the flexibility to adapt her plans as circumstances evolved. Watching her prepare for parenthood revealed new dimensions of her character that made me love her even more deeply. The prospect of raising children with Sarah felt exciting rather than overwhelming because I trusted her judgment and our ability to work together through challenges. With Victoria, discussions about having children had always felt theoretical and slightly tense, as if we both sensed that our marriage wasn't stable enough to handle the additional stress of parenthood. We'd never explicitly decided not to have children, but we'd never committed to having them either, and looking back, that hesitation had probably reflected our unconscious awareness that our relationship wasn't built to last. Sitting in my office on a rainy Seattle afternoon, reviewing plans for our next development project, I received an unexpected email that made me pause. Victoria had sent a professional inquiry about marketing services for a client who was developing eco-friendly retail spaces in Oregon. The message was completely businesslike, but it represented a level of professional maturity that impressed me. She was reaching out not because of our personal history, but because she genuinely believed her services might benefit one of our projects. I forwarded the email to Sarah with a note explaining the connection and asking for her thoughts. Her response came within minutes, suggesting we schedule a call to discuss the client's needs and see if Victoria's expertise aligned with our project goals. No jealousy, no complicated emotional processing, just a straightforward business decision based on professional merit. The ease with which Sarah handled potential collaboration with my ex-wife reminded me daily of how much healthier this relationship was than my previous marriage. The video call with Victoria took place the following week, with Sarah and me presenting our client's needs while Victoria outlined her marketing approach. The conversation was entirely professional, but I couldn't help noticing how different Victoria seemed from the woman who delivered divorce papers 5 years earlier. She appeared more confident, more authentic, more comfortable in her own skin. Success in her own business had clearly given her the kind of fulfillment that marriage to me never had. After the call, Sarah and I discussed the proposal over dinner. "She's impressive," Sarah observed. "I can see why you were attracted to her initially. She's smart and articulate, and has really good ideas for the client's positioning strategy." She paused, considering her words. "I can also see why you two weren't compatible long term. She has a very different energy from you, more intense and performance-oriented. Not better or worse, just different." The observation was typically insightful from Sarah, who had a gift for seeing people clearly without judgment. Victoria wasn't a villain in our divorce story, just someone whose personality and communication style had brought out my least authentic qualities while I'd apparently had the same effect on her. With Alex, she'd found someone who appreciated her intensity and dramatic flair. With Sarah, I'd found someone who valued my analytical nature and calm approach to conflict resolution. We decided to hire Victoria's firm for the marketing project, a decision that felt natural and uncomplicated. Professional collaboration with an ex-spouse might seem fraught with potential problems, but it actually represented the healthiest possible outcome for our divorce. We both moved forward into lives that suited us better, maintained mutual respect, and reached a place where we could interact professionally, without personal baggage interfering with business decisions. The marketing campaign Victoria developed for our client exceeded expectations, helping them achieve 60% higher foot traffic in their first 6 months than projected. Her understanding of sustainable business messaging and target audience psychology proved invaluable, and the project's success led to referrals for both our companies. By the end of the year, we'd collaborated on 3 additional projects, always maintaining clear professional boundaries while appreciating each other's expertise. The final validation of our mature post-divorce relationship came when Victoria and Alex sent a beautiful baby gift after Sarah and I announced our pregnancy. The accompanying card was signed by both of them, expressing genuine happiness for our expanding family and appreciation for the professional opportunities we'd shared. There was no awkwardness, no sense that they were making gestures out of obligation rather than authentic goodwill. As I prepared to become a father for the first time at 46, I felt grateful for every decision that had led to this moment. The divorce from Victoria hadn't been a failure, it had been a necessary transition that allowed both of us to find partnerships that actually worked. The smile I'd given her that night when she announced the end of our marriage had been prophetic in ways I couldn't have imagined at the time. Standing in the nursery, Sarah and I had designed together, watching her arrange books and toys with the same attention to detail she brought to her architecture projects. I understood something important about the difference between settling and choosing. With Victoria, I'd settled for compatibility that required constant negotiation and compromise. With Sarah, I had chosen partnership that felt natural and sustainable even when we disagreed about important decisions. The lesson wasn't that Victoria was wrong for me and Sarah was right, though that was certainly true. The deeper lesson was that some relationships serve their purpose by ending gracefully, creating space for connections that align more authentically with who we become as we grow and change. The man who'd smiled calmly while signing divorce papers had been protecting something precious, the possibility of finding love that felt like coming home rather than going to work. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.